Hi everybody, welcome to week 1 webinar, Conversations in End of Life Care. I just wanted to mention really that this webinar will be recorded so people can look at it later on, as we did in the orientation week last week. The conversation's really beginning to take off. I was looking on the discussion threads last night, and lots of people are talking about death and dying. So I'm really pleased to welcome Sam Chiramatan here today, who's Medical Director and Consultant in Palliative Medicine at St Luke's Hospice. And what I'd like you to do, and I think people have already been doing this, is as we go along, if you've got any questions, just type them in the box and we will pick those up. So the plan is that Sam is going to talk for about 20 minutes. It's really about his experience of approaching conversations around death and dying and his learning over the years. And then that will give us an opportunity then to answer any questions. So welcome, Sam. We're really excited. This is our first webinar proper for the course. And so, shall I kick off just by asking you the first question? Get around the technology. So really thinking about how you approach the conversation with patients. What's your general approach?
For me, in the context of being a palliative medicine physician, a palliative care consultant, I think a lot of it is about the starting point of what the patient knows and what the patient wants to know. Really what they understand about their condition, and really how much more they want to understand, to give them the space and the opportunity to set the agenda in the discussion. And I suppose that the challenges in clinical situations, sometimes you have a clinical imperative that we need to have a discussion because it will guide decision making or a treatment plan or a care plan. So the majority of the time, and I think this is my experience of UK palliative care and our approach to discussing death and dying, we have to go at the pace of the patient. But whilst there might be a clinical imperative, what we cannot be doing is forcing a patient to have a discussion that will be distressing or difficult or cause them more trauma. So it's kind of getting the balance between discussing what clinically we feel we need to, but more importantly being guided what the patient is able to talk about and willing to talk about. If I think about my clinical experience and my training, I'm a consultant in palliative medicine, have been since 2008, but I've worked in the field of palliative care and palliative medicine really since 2003 as a specialist field, but obviously through my training done bits and pieces of palliative care in a whole range of other specialties that I did when I was training. The experience kind of tells me that sometimes people suggest that they want to know about death and dying, and actually clinically they may even ask, how much time they may have left, or ask really about the detailed aspects of dying. But even when a patient asks you those questions directly, when an individual asks you those questions directly, they may still not really want to hear the answer. So I found in my learning that, even if I'm asked directly, I often have to ask the individual, do they really want to know? And what would they do with that information? How would that make them feel better? Now for some that's frustrating because that's the reason why they're asking is they're asking because they want to know. But for others, even simply reflecting that back at them in that way, sometimes can make people recognise that they don't want to know the answer. And so you might find someone saying to you, well, actually, I'm not sure I really know what I'd do with it. Maybe I was asking because I thought I ought to. One of my, a number of my really mentors, as I've trained, have identified situations where someone may ask, but they don't really want to know the answer. One of the things I was warned about early in my training was one thing that I definitely not to do is to ask, if you recognise someone's aiming at or moving towards asking a question about death and dying, is not to ask them what they're most concerned about and then plough into a conversation about the thing that they've just identified is the thing that will cause them the most fear.
Yeah.
So it's being sensitive and reflecting, I think. Allowing patients to ask the questions that they want. And I think there is something to be said for both empathy and really trying to be empathic in your discussions. It's an interesting thing, I think, talking online, and it warns me about both this forum is fantastic to be able to communicate to so many people. It makes me think about, for us, a foray into telemedicine that we're venturing on into, but actually not being able to see the person that you're talking to, or really to pick up on those subconscious cues in terms of body language and communication that I think are vital in helping us conduct these conversations, particularly with patients. Is a challenge. So you really have to, you can't plough on with an agenda. You have to sense what that individual wants from you and communicate appropriately. I suppose I have no set view, particularly, which may not be helpful for all of you listening, as to precisely what I would communicate or a set piece that I would discuss. But it's having some themes in your mind about the direction of discussion.
Thanks. I'll move on to the next question, Sam. So you talked there about patients, and I think I was probably going to ask you, is there a question you ask them for them to tell you what they want to know?
I suppose it's in palliative care and palliative medicine. In a strange way, when it comes to death and dying, I often think that we're at an advantage, because quite often, by the time the patient's been referred to us, they'll have had some element of discussion before. So, in a sense, we may find ourselves pushing on an open door, or just our very presence or our badge, or the location that we're conducting our discussion in, is the thing that opens the conversation. It's probably not very politically correct, but I think that quite often I find that having a Scottish accent, but having my appearance often acts as a bit of an opener to conversation that distracts people. And so if you can put people at rest, put their minds at rest, and make them recognise that the environment isn't terrifying, and actually try and engage people and relax into that environment, asking people what they understand about their illness, specifically almost asking people what they want to get out of the consultation. Because I think many times you'll hear about people who have long conversations, and then it's only by the time you get to the end of the conversation the patient actually asks a question that they've been waiting an hour to ask. So I think it's really important to get that in early, so that you can set up your consultation appropriately and come to the discussions really in detail about death and dying appropriately at the end of that point. So can I just check that we're trying to get the same thing, we're trying to achieve the same thing, that we're starting on the same page, really, what do you hope to achieve from this consultation? I think the clinical urgency of the situation will also have some weight. And so if you're sitting with someone and you've been invited into someone's home who is in distress for a range of different reasons, it's often more difficult to kind of enter into that open discussion, because you really have to focus on what the cause of the distress is. But it's kind of recognising if you have a requirement that, as a clinician, that you need to communicate a particular issue, that you've got to find a way to work that conversation to that point.
So sometimes it's hard work. as you learn from lots of different situations.
It is. And, you know, I think from being a trainee to be a consultant in palliative medicine, it has been really a wonderful learning experience, but a complex one. Listening is a really important part of it. And perhaps considering what we say before we say it, and being measured, because interestingly, our body language, our non-verbal communication can also have a major bearing on how people cope and engage. I suppose the other thing is, as I reflect on it, not necessarily about what I say, but the things I don't say or how I say something. In the course of a conversation, I might find myself being very quiet and very calm, very reflective, listening. But sometimes you might find that an individual finds it very difficult to express themselves, so you have to almost go to them. And not in an intrusive way to invade someone's personal space, but to kind of draw the conversation from them, to give them the space and the comfort to be able to have that discussion.
So sort of the next part of that really is how do you approach that conversation, perhaps with carers and family members?
I find that part of it depends on really what the patient is prepared for us to communicate. So obviously we have to be very sensitive. The patient's information is that individual's information. It is confidential. Clearly, 99% of the time, that's not statistically tested, but in the majority of the time, you know, the patients will often have a carer or dare I use the term next of kin, someone who they identify as the person most important to them, who they want to share in that conversation and to be part of it all the time. And when you're together with a family member and the patient, really you have to recognise that all the things that you're communicating, you need to be careful that you're communicating it and not communicating to the relative, ignoring the response of the patient who's there. So in those circumstances when everyone is together, what you really need to be thinking about is you're still really communicating with the patient, but you're having to respond to the relative. I often ask patients, and patients who have the capacity and capability themselves to have these discussions, whether they would be happy for me to have that discussion with the carer or the family outside of the conversation with the patients. Now that may not be saying that we're going to have that conversation immediately and go out and have that conversation, but that at some point during our clinical relationship, that I'll be sitting with a carer may approach me separately and the patient has given their consent for us to have the discussion. When I'm having a discussion separately with a carer or a family member, I do often find myself being more direct. And my rationale for that is that particularly around the time of dying, a patient, an individual who's dying may be less aware of that experience, either because of the process of dying or because of medication that we might use to manage the distress and discomfort, if that's something that people experience. So quite often I think they will determine exactly what they want and need to know, and that will be dictated by their internal resilience within themselves as to what they feel comfortable talking about. For a carer or a family member, they are the ones who are going to be there in the actively dying phase. And so whilst it is really key and critical that we have to be sensitive and supportive, and also we need still to retain that empathy where we recognise whether that carer or relative has got the wish, the will and the capability emotionally to deal with that situation. If they are suggesting that they want to be there in the home environment to support the dying, the patient may have a challenging experience, or even that things may be really calm but they want to understand it. We need to not necessarily use too flowery language or talk around the subject. We need to just be fairly direct to talk about what their experience is going to be. And I feel that because I think forewarned is forearmed. And I think that my experience to date tells me, and that's both my professional experience and my personal experience of being with someone who is dying or has died, you know, who I was close to, you never really know how you're going to feel until it's happening. And I don't think we can prepare really as best as we can, but until the moment it's actually happening, we don't really know what our own internal response is going to be. But the way that we can prepare is we can consider, we can use the act of reflecting on action to actually consider how it might make us feel, consider and recognise those feelings of anxiety, of panic, and try and find ways to manage them. That's something what I've done as a professional, and that's what I really try to do in my discussions with family members, so that they give me, if they can use their imagination to imagine what that situation is, then they can prepare themselves. And I think if you're not direct about that, I think that people will come back to you disappointed and really feel that they've been unprepared. And so that's what my experience has taught me.
I've spotted a question come up there, Sam, and I wondered whether it might be appropriate to answer it now. Is what if somebody was angry? You're having a conversation with somebody who's angry. How would you deal with that?
I mean, I suppose it kind of depends who's angry. So an individual who's going through the experience, a patient themselves may be angry, or it might be the carer who's angry. It also depends on what the cause of the anger is. You know, I think listening is always really important. Letting people finish what they have to say. My experience of supporting patients, carers, friends who are angry is often it doesn't serve to interrupt or doesn't help you to try and explain away or kind of mitigate that anger if you haven't given the person the opportunity to express themselves fully. And that sometimes just means giving people a moment to say what they want to say. Also, sometimes what I find is that when people are angry, that it takes them a while to be coherent in what they're trying to communicate to you. So they may just be expressing a lot of anger, but underneath that there might be a question or a concern or an issue that they've been trying to get help with, and you've got to get to that because that's the bit that they want you to unpack and to try and help them with. But if you interrupt, if you don't give them the space to listen, then you never get to that point. And I think, as human beings, you know, and certainly one of my experiences as a trainee, is that you kind of want to defend yourself. It's almost when you're confronted with anger, then quite often, you know, that your first response is to defend yourself or be defensive. And what's actually being open and listening, what it can often do is diffuse anger. I think that would be I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll get a response to that. I'll move on to the next slide. You talked prior to the webinar about an example that you had from when you were learning it. If you could share that with us.
I mean, there's so many experiences that I've had on my journey, and I do still very much consider myself, even as a consultant, as a student of this. I'm always learning. And, you know, I think that we have a great model of continuing professional development, but you know, this is also about continuing emotional development, really, that's and is really important. But as a junior doctor, one of the things that really had a major impact on me, and it was sort of relating to discussion about dying, but also about the experience of advancing disease. And I recall a patient who had become quadriplegic, had lost all power in their arms and legs, and lost sensation from their chest downwards as a consequence of metastatic cancer affecting their cervical spine and the thoracic spine. And they hadn't lost all sensation in their hands, they were losing some control of their neck, and they were having complex pain problems. And the patient, and this was me as a rather naive junior doctor, the patient asked me what was happening to them, and had they, what was happening to them, and what I did at the time. I was very open and very honest, and I described the progression of their cancer. I described the fact that they were reaching kind of end stage. And even if I say so myself as a student, I thought the way I described it was sensitive, and chaperone who I had with me did support the fact that it was sensitive, but the patient became really very distressed, and then we calmed down. I thought that was managed, and then shortly after, I'd made the mistake of not having that conversation, or not saving that conversation, because the patient asked it in the heat of the moment. And so I didn't save that conversation, or try to defer it to a family member. And I remember being confronted by an exceedingly angry family member at the time, who was furious that I had thought to have an open conversation about such a thing that had caused. And even though I felt that we'd got beyond it and resolved it, and we'd come to a really good understanding the patient was okay, they were furious that I'd had that conversation, and that they'd been spent a great deal of time trying to protect the patient, and that in one stroke I'd really caused a massive amount of distress. And it really taught me that both me, having thought that we'd resolved that patient's issues in the discussion afterwards, that I perhaps needed to be more sensitive about understanding whether the patient really wanted to do. And that was actually the incident that prompted my current thinking and my current approach. Did the patient really want that answer? Were they really able to prepare? And I've spoken with colleagues subsequently, and even in my training, I remember one of my consultants when I was a registrar doing some communication skills, and in the clinic setting, he said, when you're discussing that, what you're doing is you're not getting to the point. The patient's asked you, they want an answer, so you're going to annoy some people by talking around it. But I would probably prefer to talk to, risk maybe slightly frustrating a patient who wants to know and taking just a bit longer to get to the answer than I would overwhelming those who really aren't prepared to cope with it and causing them distress. So understanding what the patient really wants, taking the opportunity to ask whether or not, if it's difficult, whether they would want us to wait for a loved one or someone else to be there to support that discussion. But also, having had that discussion, if the patient had asked, really taking the opportunity to set the scene for the carer before they find themselves in the room confronted by, this is what the doctor told me. So that was an example that I felt quite strongly about.
And I think what you said to me, sort of prompt on there, is that you really felt that gap then between the theory of what we ought to be doing and actually what that's like in practice.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think communication skills, stimulated discussions, the theory of it. I really don't think that. I think if you take a chance of discounting the need for empathy in these discussions, I am quite against formulaic communication around death and dying, because I think what it does is suggest it's not it's death and dying is a personal experience to the person conducting it. And although we could probably group collections of individuals and having similar responses, I would never say that they are the same. No two individuals are the same. And so if we try to be too formulaic, what we do is we deny the patient the opportunity to be recognised as an individual. And although I don't think there's much theory that says that, it's maybe the fact that the theory doesn't really very strongly define us viewing people as individuals in those discussions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and it reflects the conversations that have been happening on the MOOC all week, really, that sense of the individual. I'll just move on to the next slide. Really, we talked a little bit in last week in the orientation week there was a section about looking after yourself and thinking about how you cope, and it was really if you could share how you cope with what often quite difficult situations.
One of the biggest things for me is being part of a team. And I mean, so working at St Luke's and working with the team I work with is really, it's phenomenal. But what we're doing is you're having peer support on multiple levels, whether that be peer support from consultants, whether that be peer support from clinical executives, whether it be peer support from nursing colleagues or other allied health professionals. It's actually the capacity within the environment to recognise that something in our model of part of care, it's about the multi-professional team, and you're not on your own, and that you mustn't consider yourself being on your own. It's about trying to access the opportunities for reflection and discussion, and finding those moments to find trusted people where you can, in a trusted, safe environment where you can share some of those difficulties. I think my perception, certainly that I've carried from early in my career, is the mistake of thinking that as a professional you should be able to contain this internally, and that actually that this is, because I think that at some point the pressure valve will release, and I think the value of having the capacity to reflect, now whether that be through formal mechanisms like a Schwartz round or having reflective practice meetings, but having that opportunity to reflect allows controlled release. I think if you fail to do that, I think what you will find is that will just suddenly, at some point, whether it be a year, whether it be after a career of 20 years, I think that it will overwhelm you. Now, I'm not naive to think that actually even having that capacity to express and reflect regularly will completely protect you from the risk of burnout as a professional. I think that it's a really important factor in being able to look after yourself. I think it's one of the things I consider for lone workers or professionals who perhaps don't have those opportunities for multi-professional working. I think it's challenging, but I think you have to find a forum. And obviously within the bounds of confidentiality, you have to find a forum where you can express and reflect on, because sometimes just listening to someone telling you something will be really helpful, and it will help you consider whether you're thinking about all the things that are relevant in life. I think that the day-to-day can be difficult at times. I think you mustn't forget that there's pressure, all the time to be doing the right thing. But I think if you can be sensitive and you can recognise the needs of the patients, the needs of the carer, the needs of your team, I think that really is a very powerful thing. I think that protects you. A healthy team is full of healthy individuals, and I think that makes a difference. I think also a recognition that you cannot get it right 100% of the time is critically important. And I remember in my training being advised that the two things that I remember going to work somewhere in near London, and I remember arriving for my induction. And my general induction in this hospital that I was working with, I was gathered together, and I met a senior surgeon in that team. And he asked me, because he didn't know at the time what I did, and I said I was here to do palliative care. And in a quite stark way, which has always stuck with me, he said, "Oh, you deal with all our failures." And I thought that it really hit me, first of all, to consider that actually that these circumstances were failures, because we're never going to get things 100% right. We hope, and we hope for cure in many cases, but death is part of the human condition. And so for us as a profession to be describing things in the terms of failure, I think is incorrect. And I think it causes anxiety, it causes stress. And the moment that you recognise that you can't get it 100% right, and I have patients, or I've had patients in the past, not many, but I've had those that you cannot fix that thing. And quite often you might need to offer some sedation to manage it. Thankfully, those situations are few and far between, but they do arise. And I think it's recognising that we can only do our best, but also there is always something that we can do. It may just not be the thing that we hoped we could do.
Yeah. Yeah. And can I just ask you a final question before we go to everybody else's questions? How do you switch off? We've been trying to encourage each other to look after ourselves. How do you switch off?
Well, it's obviously not everyone's in that position. Children kind of force you to switch off because they draw all of your attention. So at those moments, I've got two very lively boys who draw a lot of my time and attention when I'm with them. So that's who I'm very proud of, and that really forces you to focus on things. Exercise, I don't mean to sound like a textbook, but exercise is helpful. And I actually, in the past, and just getting back to it, I do jiu-jitsu, a martial art, and so that is quite literally a vent for all of my frustration. And so I can be as contained or controlled as I want in emotionally within the clinical environment. And then I have a controlled vent through jiu-jitsu, and I can actually express myself. I hear other people do it with exercise or listening to ABBA, or there are lots of people who have different ways, but I think it's about being able to find something that really feeds or nourishes your soul and you as a person.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a number of questions actually that I want to pose to you, and just really to welcome any latecomers to the room. Our numbers are increasing all the time. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available for people to view the whole thing. And once again, thanks Sam for agreeing to come and have this conversation. So the first question on the list, and I've got a number, so hopefully we'll get through these. Is it hard not to get emotionally involved with patients when you're with them over a period of time?
I think when I was earlier in my training, I found that very difficult. Now I think that this is slightly different for different professionals. If I think about my nursing colleagues who are actually caring physically for patients, often whether that be a qualified nurse or a healthcare assistant, they're actually often doing very intimate tasks that are very close to that individual, and so there's a lot of contact with the patient that actually prompts those kind of emotional connections. As a physician, particularly as I've become more senior, I sometimes find that my position often forces a bit of distance, which is very difficult to deal with in the transition from being a junior doctor to being a consultant, or being a trainee to being a consultant, because it's that connection that with the patient that you feel enables you to help people, to develop the rapport. As a senior clinician, I've got a short time to make that connection. And what I recognise is sometimes stories are so incredibly sad. As someone who is a human being who has emotions and prides himself on being able to try and be empathic to the needs of others, it's very it's easy to get drawn in. But the thing I always remind myself is what I'm being relied on for in my role as a consultant, as a physician, as a professional, is my objectivity.
Yeah.
And so what I need to be is objective, not distant, but objective. And if I concentrate on that, I guess it's the training that I've had, the mentors that I've looked to, the bits of those people that I've taken to construct this almost the demeanour or the character that I am in clinical practice, that it's concentrating on that allows me to retain objective and almost protect myself, but also be the most use I can to the patient I'm looking after. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think what comes across is that you feel emotion,
Yes.
but you don't feel you get emotionally involved with the person.
It's you know, and that's not to say, I mean, I will always say to trainees who come, and we have student doctors, medical students with us almost every week, and one of the things that I say is there will always be those patients, a patient who reminds you of a sister, a brother, a cousin, a friend, a parent, a grandparent, and they will get under your skin. And it's not in a negative way, but they'll get under your radar. And you won't necessarily find yourself able to protect yourself from the emotion. But working within a multi-professional environment, enabling your colleagues to directly comment and support you, and actually just help you reflect on it, helps you actually recognise sometimes maybe I'm getting a bit too close to this.
Yeah.
And that's why for us in our practice at St Luke's, the multi-professional team is so key.
Yeah.
Because it allows, if you can't be objective, someone else will be for you.
Yeah, that's interesting. That I've got another question. How do you deal with a situation when the patient and carer want different things?
It's a difficult thing, and I suppose we talk about being patient-centred in what we do, and so really the patients need to drive really everything that we do. But it isn't uncommon. If I use an example about going home, a patient has exceedingly complex needs, perhaps doesn't have the ability to recognise the challenge or the experience and the impact that's having on those around them, and a carer wants to be deeply supportive, and sometimes, and really wants to do the right thing, but doesn't feel that they're in a position to do that. That the strain of doing whatever has gone before in that particular circumstance is so much that on one hand the patient will say, oh, yes, absolutely, I need you to come home, and then they'll walk out the door and 2 seconds later they'll be saying there's no way I can manage this, it's all too much, we'll never cope, it's really difficult. I think really, for me, a really important role for us is to bring people together, and is to try and enable honest discussion, because we can go around the houses as much as possible, but what I really need to do is to invite that carer or that relative, if we're talking about the experience of going back into a challenging environment, to describe how it makes them feel. 9 times out of 10, again, not statistically measured, but more frequently than not, in those circumstances, the patient or the individual with the condition or the concern will recognise that they're not an island, and that actually they are dependent on the needs of the carer and the ability for the carer to manage. If that carer is unable to manage that situation and they break, the patient will end up in an environment where they don't want to be. That's often, I don't necessarily describe it in those terms, but that's something that I will try and explain in the broadest sense to patients, and when they have that understanding, it's often easier for them to come together to have a discussion. But there will be cases where what people want are just completely exclusive, and they're not connected.
Yeah, and that's the hard.
Yeah, and that's the hardest one.
Yeah. How do you deal again with the family wanting to protect the patient, and does this prevent them from receiving the care that they want? So. Protecting the patient from what might happen.
I think my experience tells me that a lot of the time the patient actually knows what's going on, and a lot of the time the reason why the family member is protecting the patient is because they believe the patient doesn't know, and so, but the patient already knows and is protecting the family member. And so it's actually trying to bring people together to recognise that they already know what's going on. There will be circumstances where, where a patient, and obviously the carer will know their relative better than I ever will from the short encounter, but that I often will have, But there will be circumstances where actually the patient really doesn't have the resilience, that individual doesn't have the internal reserve to manage the distress of that situation. But that we can only confirm by speaking to the patient sensitively. And once we've got that confirmation, what I will often do is I'll ask the patient for their permission to make best decisions on their behalf in consultation with the wider family member or the wider family or carers. And that allows us to get beyond that.
Yeah. So again, it's bringing them together, isn't it? It's getting that conversation between them happening. I've just noticed a couple of people that have come into the webinar late, and we are recording the whole of the webinar, and at the moment a number of people have posed questions which I'm now asking Sam and he's responding to. What about when the patient doesn't want interventions but the family do, particularly with children and the elderly?
That's an interesting one. Now, I haven't cared for a great many children. Most of the care I deliver is adult care. But I think the principles are the same. Certainly with the elderly, I think the principles are really fairly clear. The patient is the one who will be receiving the intervention. Yes. And if that patient does not want that intervention, does not want to continue, it really isn't incumbent on me as a professional or anyone else to compel them to have something. And so we've got to just be sure that the reasons why they've made that decision are rational, or if they're irrational, that they are understandable, that there isn't some dysfunction of brain or mind or thought process, or some just simply factually inaccurate information that's led them to come to that conclusion. And once they have, it's just really setting the scene, acknowledging the difficulty or the emotional experience of the carer who wants that intervention, but also trying to avoid being condescending. We're not in that situation. We cannot know on an individual level how that will feel for that individual. But just recognising and acknowledging that the patient's wishes are the things that drive this. And often if their experience, they have to recognise that they're living through this condition, good or bad. And it's not necessarily for us to make a judgment whether that is a good quality of life or not. That's for the patient to decide on. And it won't be us who's having the needle or having the colonoscopy or receiving the chemotherapy or the radiotherapy. It won't be us who are living with the side effects of those treatments. So it's not really for anyone else to tell someone that they should receive it. Now, clearly with children it's slightly different. But I would say slightly, in the sense that it really is important to continue to have that open communication. My experience of supporting the children of dying relatives is that they want to know, they want to be involved. And quite often, from my own personal experience, growing up and being confronted by mortality of a grandparent, but being protected, it left me with a terrified feeling about death. Where actually, if I could have asked them very simple questions, it would have probably managed those anxieties which I carried for many years.
I think it's been very evident on the discussion boards that people's personal experience of death has an impact on the professional
Absolutely.
as well.
Absolutely.
And I think somebody was interested in what you were talking about, your own training. So this question is, did you find it difficult as a student not to let your own personality affect the way you dealt with certain situations?
That's a difficult one, because I'm not sure what my own personality is.
Yeah, I thought that's
I suppose you will all out there have a view of what my personality is. I guess, it comes back to that professional demeanour that I'm trying to portray. I don't mean it to sound like I'm not being genuine, but I do. My personal belief is that patients and carers have a view of what they expect of me as a consultant. that means wearing a certain type of clothes, speaking in a certain type of way, and to a certain extent, part of it is about playing to that required role. And so if I have a feeling about what I believe is the professional character that I should be portraying, that actually means that my personality is left out of it, because it's not about me. It's about the patient, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reflect what they need. And that some people might consider that being a bit disingenuous, or that you're kind of faking it. But I think it's that empathy about what are people expecting of you, not only the words you say, but your behaviours, what are they expecting you as a professional. And if you can have a view on that, and not every time it will be the same. So when I'm speaking to patients, I'd be interested to know what my colleagues think, but that sometimes that I will be very quiet. I don't know if demure is the right word. You may not believe it, but I will be, I'll be reserved, very quiet, silent, listening a lot, and I'll wait to draw those conversations out. Recently I remember supporting a patient who was very challenging, and they were, in some senses, they seemed quite distressed by the situation, but that was being covered up by quite a kind of brusque, kind of abrasive manner, very in your face, and they were constantly challenging the staff around me with the fact that that they were dying, and they knew they were dying, and it was almost trying to make everyone else not necessarily maliciously feel uncomfortable, but it was kind of putting everyone else on the back foot. And in those situations, quite often I will be very different, and I might take a more kind of brusque, I'll reflect the personality that's coming at me, and it's kind of making a judgment, what do I need to reflect here? What's really difficult in describing this to you is that almost these judgments and views are things that happen in seconds. It's not something that you clinically have the time to sit down and make a judgment most of the time. But there will be times when this is the demeanour of the personality, so you need to play a certain role. And that's, I think that's what
I think as well that question says something to me about sometimes you have a bit of a personality clash, and that can happen to anybody, can't it?
And I think that there will be times. So it is difficult, because sometimes people can be so emotionally overwrought by what they're going through that they can be quite hostile. And if that's continuous, or if they're, I don't know if it's the right way to see it, terminal illness can upset people and make people upset and distressed and angry. But actually, your personality is your personality, and some people can be challenging. And it's not terminal illness that makes them challenging, it's their personality. There are people who you will maybe not get on with in the course of your personal life, but you need to find a way to manage that. And if you're finding that your personality is getting in the way of that interaction, that's why it's so important to have a team or alternative members, not only to reflect on that and help you manage your own response and your behaviours, but also to ask someone to take the lead if that feels like the best way. And so maybe someone else has got a better approach at approaching a situation.
I think certainly from a radiotherapy background, that's something that we were aware of. It. Some patients you click with, and they will come back to you for support. That happens, that's life, isn't it? A question here, and I think you've touched on this quite a bit in terms of support from your team, but do you think clinical supervision is important?
I think it is important. I think I have to be a little bit careful. I think there are lots of different models of clinical supervision, individual supervision, group supervision. There are lots of different models of kind of giving someone the space to reflect. I do think it also depends on who you are as an individual, because I think types of supervision will suit you. There are some individuals who will never respond well to group supervision if that's the only thing that's on offer, particularly if they're going through a difficult time. As a professional, maybe that's not going to be helpful. individual supervision, maybe people are not self-starters in the sense of reflecting, but actually by listening to other people's experiences, it gives them the opportunity to reflect. So group supervision may be more suitable for those individuals. But I think it's important to be able to recognise whether it can be valuable, and in the hope that we can find a way to provide that as an organisation, and trying to allow you. I think at the very least, organisationally, it's important for us when we're freshly caring for dying people to create a space where we recognise that the constant care of dying, the constant management of, and that's not because when I say the constant care of dying, it makes it sound like death is always challenging, and actually there are many cases where death is measured and calm and comfortable and peaceful and really a very, to say pleasant is the wrong word, but it's a calm experience. And for some it's a welcome release from challenging times. For some it's just a release from frailty. But I suppose in the context of specialist palliative care, we tend to be there to deal with people at the end of the spectrum where there are challenges. And all of that distress and emotion, it has to land somewhere. And you have to find a way to deal with it. And supervision is, I think, as good a way as any, but you've got to find the right model for you.
Yeah, and I think it's making that available within organisations, isn't it, within different settings, because it isn't available to people.
Or within a team, again, coming back to the principle of team working, providing the space even within your own team to create that opportunity. But I think it's really important to also understand what the models of supervision are. Yeah. And that there's a difference between supervision and a chat over coffee. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that we were talking about.
Yeah. And somebody's reflected that back about death can be a calm experience, and certainly that, family members, that's my experience. A question here, I hope you can answer this. What is your experience of power of attorney and will within your role, I suppose that is?
I think in UK practice, since the kind of the Growth of the Mental Capacity Act and all the things that have come with that, I think that they're increasingly important. Lasting power of attorney, I think, is a really important issue. Wills are useful. I suppose we used to call advanced decisions to refuse treatment a living will. So if we're talking about things from an advanced care planning perspective, I think that they're really important. And I think what they do is they empower both the patient and the carer to either have decisions made in advance or the opportunity to be really deeply engaged at the heart of decision making. I don't think we do enough of them, and I would really like to encourage people to think about it.
Yeah, and as you say, to do that early enough, ahead of being in any situation.
I think one of the challenges is, both nationally and internationally, the taboo of discussing death actually disadvantages. Yeah. I think the inability for us to talk about death and dying actually prevents us from preparing and undertaking using these tools that really empower us to manage a really important experience of our component of our living. If I think about, I have heard from many ladies about the complexities of producing birth plans and how the birth plan is never the same as the reality. But it's not the actual plan itself, the fact that it doesn't go from A to B or A to Z is not the issue. It's the fact that you've thought that there is an A and there is a Z, and that there is uncertainty in between, and giving yourself the capacity to manage that, and how you control that, or how you try and create a situation where you control that as best as possible. And I think that's what Will's doing, what Will's doing.
We've got 5 minutes left, and we've got 3 questions.
So I'll try and get short answers.
What do you say to somebody when they ask you that question, am I going to die?
As a trainee, as a junior doctor, I was confronted by that situation, and the patient said, I'm going to die. Am I going to die? And I said, no, it wasn't in the past care setting. I said, no, don't be silly, we're here to help you. And the patient promptly died pretty much on the setting. They arrested and died. And that really had a really profound effect on me, because actually, that was quite an acute situation, and I was completely unprepared for that. I try not to lie, but it comes back to, do you really want to know that?
Yeah.
Is that something, do you really want me to answer that question? And just reflecting it for a moment gives people a moment to actually think, what are you going to do with that answer? Because actually, if that answer is now going to keep you awake at night for every hour of your remaining time, is it worth it? If it is, actually, I need to know that, because I need to decide what I'm going to do with my dog, and what, and that's not trivial. What am I going to say to my children, or my wife, or my father, or whatever? If that's important to understand that, then you need to. Then in those circumstances, after asking if that's what they really want to know, I would prepare them and say, unfortunately, I think that you are, yes, and I would be honest, but you're really at the gaze of them actually answering.
Sometimes they answer it themselves.
Yes.
They ask the question and they answer.
And you can reflect that, and I suppose you can say, do you think you're going to die? And quite often people will say, yes, I do, and then you can confirm, yes, I think that's the case.
And this is an interesting one. I did see this one pop up, but people have given me the list. So, how do you cope with helplessness in patients?
Trying to reset what an individual's goals are. As a clinician, as a palliative care physician, when I was training, I often found myself feeling helpless. But it's that thing of recognising that you cannot fix everything. Some things are inevitable. And if you can help people understand that and try and get them to reset their goals, then actually, if the thing that a patient who's got spinal cord compression wants to do is to walk to the shop, and that they feel helpless because they can't do that for themselves, you have to kind of find a way to be realistic and say that that's not going to happen. But if the object is to get to the shop, but walking to the shop is not the point. If the point is to get to the shop, then how can we get you there? And whilst we may not be able to get there independently, that we need to find a way to maintain your independence, or the feeling of independence, and get you there. And it's about what the outcome that they're seeking is. If it's about trying to fight against the inevitable, I think it's just listening. Because actually, if someone is dying and they don't want to die, we can't change that. Not in those circumstances. And it's just giving people the opportunity, because people get there in the end. The very fact that they're feeling frustrated means they understand.
And a difficult conversation will allow them to reflect on that one. Yeah. I'm conscious now we have run out of time, and first of all, I'd really like to thank Sam for the conversation and for sharing that. I'd like to thank everybody that's come into the room to listen, and you will see, you will be able to see the whole recording and reflect on it as well as part of the work that you're going to do for the course. Want to thank as well St Luke's, Sam's medical director there, and for their involvement in the course of actually helping you get here today.
It's great, and we'd also at the hospice at St Luke's like to thank the Sheffield Hallam team for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation, and for you all to engage in it. It's a really great forum, great opportunity, so thank you.
And thanks to everybody. And we will continue the chat, I'm sure, on the conversation spaces. Good night. My children's future.